Good morning. I think I have a slide. Oh, yeah. So what I want to do this morning is sort of offer a little bit of context about where we are, a little bit of how we got here, and where we need to go. And I want to use as our reference point the African American experience in the United States. So what you should understand from that slide is that almost 63%, 62% of the African American experience in the United States, we were slaves. And you have to understand what the slave tradition is. In slavery, what the law said was, make them stand in fear. There was no protection for the slave from whatever his master wanted to do with him. The idea was that the master, it was his property, and he could maim it, kill it, do whatever he wants. And the power of slavery still exists today. If you think about it, we have people who want to celebrate the Confederate flag. That's that slave tradition. There are people in the south part of the United States who still think racial preferences are okay. For African Americans, the story I would tell you about slavery, and I was talking a little bit about it at dinner last night, was that in the 19th century, when whites here in Washington were leaving the city during the summer because it was swamp and mosquitoes and unpleasant, so whites would leave, they would take their slaves and they would kennel them at Lawton Prison. Slave didn't break any law, hadn't done anything illegal, but the fact is his master or her master wanted to kennel them. The relationship between Lawton Prison and the black community in DC gets set by that experience, right? So that when blacks come in and out of Lawton, even in the 20th century, it doesn't carry the same stigma that whites would think about it when they think about going to prison, because guess what? By definition, the social system has put you out of bounds. You have a whole different frame of reference about it. What you should also understand is that the slave tradition, Jim Crowism, African Americans did not participate in the market economy. I love it when people today say, African Americans, how come they don't participate in the free market? How come they want handouts? The whole social system, right, for almost 80 years was designed to keep you out of the free market. Think about it. In that era of Jim Crow, it was illegal for an African American to go to a library. Could not go to a library. In slavery, could not read a book. It was illegal to read a book. So when you tell me that African Americans are not embracing education, you have to understand the traditions that were created during these periods when African Americans were property, when they were disenfranchised. And so the important moment obviously comes in 1965. That's only 12% of our experience. When I talk to my friends, my Chinese friends, their history goes back thousands of years of culture, right? When I speak to my European friends, they're talking about thousands of years of university experiences and culture that are not part of the African American experience. We are a New World people born out of slavery. That's the hard fact of the matter. And even more importantly, it is not just that it impacted African Americans, it impacted whites. Whites, they think of African Americans as people who can't compete. You hear that whole affirmative action discussion when people say, well, it only takes a generation, we'll let them in for a generation and then they should be able to take care of themselves. But they want to ignore 80% of our history in this country. So here's the challenge, and I think the important challenge, and the reason why the world has changed, and the reason why the conversation that you're having today is so very important. It is about the browning of America. The majority of children born today are brown, period. You cannot send them to prison at the rate you're currently doing it. You will not have a sustainable society if African Americans and brown people are going to prison at the rate that they're doing it today. Even more importantly, by 2020, which is for all intents and purposes about 5 years away, 40% of the US population is black and brown. By the time you get to 2040, they're the majority. They are the workforce. They are the army. You cannot have a system like what we have right now. So the conversation that we need to have is really about how do we build sustainable communities. Think about Ferguson, completely upside down community, completely upside down. And it comes out of that slave tradition. It comes out of that Jim Crow condition in which the society itself, whites who are in the government establishment, decide that they can have a predatory experience with the African American community by using the law, by arresting them, by fining them, by redistributing wealth using the law. You can't have Fergusons. And Ferguson is not unique. There are a bunch of Fergusons out there. You cannot have a society like that going forward. So the conversation that needs to be had is, so how do we build, given what we've got to work with in terms of all this past, all of this underbrush that has to be pushed away, how do we build sustainable communities? And I would say to you that the conversation that you're having today, there are others in other sectors of our society who are having it about education, they're having it about health care, and we need to bring it together. Because the point is that social systems, they have outputs. They have features to them. So when you say health disparities, what you're really talking about is pattern behavior that happens generation after generation. Booker T. Washington talked about health disparities. W.E.B. Du Bois talked about health disparities. This ain't a new conversation. But what's different is that the society itself needs us to fundamentally change. So I would argue and present to you that you need to partner up. You need to reach out and become part of a much broader conversation about how do we build sustainable communities that embraces the broad diversity of this country. Because if we don't do that, we are going to have instability. We're going to continue to use our police force to make black and brown people stand in fear. And that's what's happening today. That's why when you see police shooting black people in Chicago, in Ferguson, in New York, and everybody says, we can't interrupt. We don't want to stop the policemen from holding down the output of all of this years of discrimination. That's what police are being used for, to push down all of this frustration, alienation. And so if we want to transform that, I think the most important thing to do is to begin to consider, so what do we want the future to look like? How do we build it? How do we come together? I think that's our challenge. Thank you.